So, me caveman, let's go. Number 10. The Chavín Culture. Imagine being led into a mountain. The passage narrows. The torchlight flickers against wet granite. Somewhere ahead, a sound begins. A low roar that seems to come from the stone itself, and you cannot tell if it is water, or a voice, or a beast. This is the world the Chavín built more than 3,000 years ago, high in the Peruvian Andes, at a place called Chavín de Huántar. It sits at about 3,180 meters above sea level, at the meeting point of the coast, the mountains, and the Amazon. Construction of its ceremonial heart began around 900 BCE and continued for centuries. At the crossing of its underground galleries stands the Lanzón, a white granite monolith about 4.5 meters tall, carved into a snarling deity with fangs, serpent hair, and taloned hands. Narrow ducts cut through the surrounding stone may have carried the voice of a hidden priest, so that the god itself seemed to speak. In 2001, a Stanford team led by John Rick uncovered 20 conch shell trumpets, called pututus, deep inside the complex. When acoustic researchers returned in 2008, they found something remarkable. The galleries resonate at the same frequencies as those shell trumpets, and as the human male voice. This was engineering, but not of stone alone. It was engineering of the senses. Carvings at the site show figures holding the San Pedro cactus, a plant that contains mescaline. Picture it now. A pilgrim, disoriented in the dark, dosed with a hallucinogen, surrounded by echoing blasts of sound, and the roar of water channeled beneath the floor. The Chavín had no writing. They had no standing army. They had no single king that we can identify. And yet, their art style spread across a vast stretch of Peru, carried on textiles, ceramics, and gold. They traded for spondylus shell from 1,000 kilometers away and obsidian from distant quarries. How does a culture with no soldiers and no script come to dominate an entire region? The mainstream answer is that Chavín was a pilgrimage center, a place people traveled to willingly. Others argue the whole site was a deliberate machine for manufacturing awe, and therefore authority. A few go further and call it an ancient sound technology. The cult faded around 200 BCE, and no one is certain why. But the Andes never forgot it. And it is only the beginning of our countdown, because from a culture that ruled by wonder, we move to an empire that ruled the Red Sea. Number 9. The Aksumite Empire. In the 3rd century, a Persian prophet named Mani listed the 4 great powers of the world. He named Rome. He named Persia. He named China. And he named a kingdom in the highlands of northern Ethiopia that most people today have never heard of. That kingdom was Aksum. For roughly the first 6 centuries of the Common Era, Aksum controlled the trade of the Red Sea, the crossroads between the Roman Mediterranean and the markets of India. Aksum did something almost no other ancient African state did. From the late 3rd century, it minted its own coins in gold, silver, and bronze. The coins carried inscriptions in Greek for foreign traders and in Ge'ez for its own people, and they were struck to weights compatible with Roman currency. Around 325 to 330, King Ezana converted to Christianity, making Aksum one of the first states on earth to adopt the religion, at almost the same moment as Rome. Aksum became the first state anywhere to place the cross on its coins. Then there are the stelae. The Aksumites raised giant carved granite obelisks over the tombs of their kings, single blocks of stone carved to look like tall buildings, with false doors and rows of false windows. The largest, the Great Stele, would have stood about 33 meters and weighed roughly 520 tons. It is thought to have collapsed during the very attempt to raise it. It ranks among the largest single stones that human beings have ever tried to lift. Another, about 24 meters tall, was looted by Italy in 1937, displayed in Rome for decades, and finally returned to Ethiopia in 2005. Aksum's port of Adulis sent ivory, gold, and tortoiseshell out into the world. Its language, Ge'ez, was written in a script that grew from a simple consonant system into a full alphabet with vowels marked, and that script survives to this day in the churches of Ethiopia and Eritrea. Ezana's own inscriptions record his armies sacking the city of Meroe, a civilization we will meet later in this very countdown. Why did such a power fade? The rise of Islam redrew the trade routes. The soil grew tired. The port lost its edge. But consider what remains. One of the oldest continuously practiced forms of Christianity on the planet, a living script, and coins that once announced to the world that Africa held one of its 4 great empires. From an empire built on trade, we descend now to a people who built a city out of solid rock and out of water. Number 8. The Nabataeans. Petra receives barely 100 millimeters of rain in a year. It is carved into a desert canyon where, by every logic of geography, no great city should exist. And yet, at its height, Petra held as many as 30,000 people. The secret of the Nabataeans was not gold or armies, it was water. These were originally nomadic Arabs who settled the deserts of southern Jordan, and by the last few centuries, BCE, they had built a trading kingdom of staggering wealth. To hold a city in that landscape, they built more than 200 cisterns, along with dams, channels, and pipelines of terracotta. They tapped a spring called Ain Musa, about 7 kilometers away, and carried its water into the city by gravity, controlling the flow and pressure through carefully engineered pipes. The famous entrance to Petra is the Sikh, a narrow canyon more than a kilometer long. Water channels run along its walls, and the Nabataeans built a dam and a tunnel to divert flash floods away from it, so that the deadly desert torrents could not drown their visitors. Their wealth came from scent. The Nabataeans held a near monopoly on the incense trade, moving frankincense and myrrh from southern Arabia to the markets of the Mediterranean. These resins were among the most precious substances in the ancient world, burned in temples and at funerals. Whoever controlled their transit grew rich, and Petra sat astride the road. With that wealth, they carved their monuments directly into rose-colored sandstone cliffs, including the towering facade the world now calls the Treasury. The Nabataeans wrote in a flowing script descended from Aramaic, and that script is the direct ancestor of the Arabic alphabet used by hundreds of millions today. Their golden age came under kings named Aretas, the third and the fourth. They made some of the finest thin-painted pottery of the ancient Near East. And then, in 106, Rome annexed the kingdom. An earthquake in the year 363, and the shift of trade to sea lanes, sent Petra into a long decline until it was nearly forgotten by the outside world. A Swiss explorer named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt reached it in 1812, disguised, guided in by a local who did not know he was showing it to the West. Even now we cannot say for certain what the treasury was for. A royal tomb perhaps, or a temple. In 2024, archaeologists found a tomb complex hidden beneath it, with human remains still inside. The Nabataeans mastered a single resource and turned a desert into one of antiquity's richest cities. But mastery of water is one thing. Our next civilization gave the world something even more powerful. It gave the world writing. Number 7. The Shang Dynasty. Roughly 1/5 of all the people alive today write using a system descended from the cracks in a burned bone. That is not a metaphor. It is history, and it begins with the Shang Dynasty of ancient China, which ruled the Yellow River Valley from about 1600 to 1046 BCE. The Shang are the earliest Chinese dynasty confirmed by both archaeology and written records, and their last capital lay at a place we now call Anyang. The Shang kings wanted to speak with their ancestors and with the high god, Di. To do it, they practiced a kind of divination. A diviner would apply intense heat to an ox shoulder blade or a turtle shell until it cracked, and then read the pattern of the cracks as an answer. Afterward, the question, and sometimes the outcome, was carved into the bone. These are the oracle bones, and the writing on them is the earliest well-attested Chinese script, about 3,000 years old. More than 150,000 inscribed fragments have been recovered. They contain several thousand distinct characters, of which over 1,000 have been read. And those characters are the direct ancestors of the ones a fifth of humanity writes today. The Shang were also masters of bronze. They used a piece mold method, building clay molds in sections around a core, a technique different from the lost wax casting used in the West. At Anyang, archaeologists recovered more than 2 metric tons of ritual bronze vessels, used in banquets to honor the dead. One vessel, the Humuwu Ding, weighs about 832 kilograms, the heaviest ancient bronze object ever found. In 1976, archaeologists found something extraordinary, an untouched tomb belonging to a woman named Fu Hao. Inside were over 200 bronze vessels, some 750 jade objects, and more than 130 weapons. Fu Hao was a consort of King Wu Ding, and she was a general. She is named in as many as 180 oracle bone inscriptions, some recording her leading armies of thousands into battle. The Shang world was stratified, held together by ancestor worship and by the terror of large-scale human sacrifice. It fell to the Zhou around 1046 BCE. And here's the strange twist. The oracle bones were forgotten. For centuries, farmers dug them up and ground them into medicine, calling them dragon bones. Only in 1899 did a scholar named Wang Yirong recognize the marks as ancient writing. From China, our countdown now travels to Africa, to a kingdom that built pyramids, smelted iron, and ruled Egypt itself. Number 6. The Kingdom of Kush. There is a country today with more ancient pyramids than Egypt. That country is Sudan, and the pyramids were built by the Kingdom of Kush. This is one of the great corrections that archaeology forces upon us. The pyramid, the literate state, the mighty army, none of these belonged to Egypt alone. Kush was a Nubian kingdom of the Middle Nile, and it lasted through capitals at Kerma, Napata, and finally Meroe, from around 1070 BCE to 350 of the Common Era. Then comes the astonishing part. For roughly a century, the kings of Kush conquered and ruled Egypt itself as the 25th dynasty. King Paye swept north around 727 BCE and recorded his victory on a great stele. His successors, including the famous Taharqa, built monuments across both Egypt and Nubia until the Assyrians drove them back south in the 660s BCE. But Kush did not die. It endured for another 9 centuries. After about 300 BCE, its center shifted to Meroe, a land rich in iron ore and in the hardwood forests needed to make charcoal. Meroe became a great ironworking center. Archaeologists have found its smelting furnaces and vast heaps of slag. And the royal cemetery there holds more than 200 pyramids, steep and narrow, with small bases, quite different in shape from the pyramids of Giza. The Kushites developed their own writing, the Meroitic script, around the 2nd century BCE, one of Africa's own indigenous alphabets. And here's a genuine mystery. We can read the sounds of Meroitic. We can sound out the words, but we still do not understand the language. It remains only partly deciphered to this day. Kush was famous for its archers. The Egyptians called the land Taseti, the land of the bow. It was ruled at times by powerful queens, the Candaces. One of them resisted Rome, and the Kushites carried off a bronze head of the Emperor Augustus and buried it beneath a temple threshold so that worshippers would forever trample the emperor's face. By around 350, Kush fell, sacked by the rising power of Aksum. Much later, in the 1830s, a treasure hunter named Giuseppe Ferlini blew the tops off dozens of its pyramids searching for gold. From a kingdom that reminds us the pyramid was an African invention shared across the Nile, we go now to the civilization that raised the pyramid higher than any other. Number 5. The Old Kingdom Egyptians. We call it the Age of the Pyramids. The Old Kingdom of Egypt, roughly 2686 to 2181 BCE, is when a civilization learned to build in stone on a scale the world had never seen. And we can actually watch them learn. That is the wonderful thing. The learning curve is written into the desert. It starts with a single genius. Imhotep, chancellor to King Djoser, designed the step pyramid at Saqqara around 2670 BCE, the world's first large building made of cut stone. He stacked 6 great platforms, one on the next. Imhotep was so revered that centuries later he was worshipped as a god of medicine and wisdom, an almost unheard of honor for a man not born royal. Then came King Sneferu, who built 3 pyramids. His bent pyramid changes its angle partway up, as if the builders lost their nerve, or learned mid-construction that their slope was too steep. His next, the Red Pyramid, was the first true smooth-sided pyramid that succeeded. You can see the trial and error, monument by monument. And then the masterpiece. The Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza, built around 2600 BCE. It used an estimated 2.3 million blocks, weighing some 6 million tons in total, and it was raised in roughly 26 years. It stood about 146 meters tall, and it remained the tallest structure on Earth for around 3,800 years. It is the only one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world still standing. Its base is level to within a few centimeters, and its sides align almost exactly to the cardinal directions. The workers were not slaves. Excavations near Giza revealed their villages, with bakeries, breweries, and evidence of medical care. The Egyptians also gave us a calendar of 365 days, an ancestor of the one on your wall, and they practiced rational medicine. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, copied from an Old Kingdom original, describes 48 injury cases with careful diagnosis and even honest prognosis, telling the physician when an ailment could be treated and when it could not, with almost no reliance on magic. The Old Kingdom collapsed around 2181 BCE. As the climate dried, the Nile ran low, and famine broke the central state. But its engineering, its medicine, its mathematics, and its calendar echoed through Greece, through Rome, and into our own age. From the civilization that reached for the sky, we now turn to the empire that reached for almost half of humanity. Number 4. The Achaemenid Persians. At its height, around 480 BCE, a single empire ruled an estimated 44% of all the people alive on Earth. That is the highest share of humanity that any empire, before or since, is thought to have governed. It was the Achaemenid Empire of Persia, founded by Cyrus the Great, and it stretched from the Indus Valley across Iran and Mesopotamia to Egypt and the edge of Europe, some 5.5 million square kilometers. What made it new was not just its size, but how it was held together. When Cyrus captured Babylon in 539 BCE, he did not raise it. According to the Cyrus Cylinder, a clay document now in the British Museum, he allowed deported peoples to return home and rebuild their temples. That cylinder is sometimes called the First Charter of Human Rights, though scholars caution it follows old Mesopotamian royal customs. Still, the principle was radical. Cyrus governed a patchwork of peoples by letting them keep their own laws, their own gods, and their own customs. His successor, Darius I, turned that into a system. He divided the empire into about 20 provinces called satrapies, each run by a governor, and each watched by royal inspectors known as the king's eyes and ears. He standardized the coinage with a gold coin called the Daric, and he built the royal road, running about 2,500 kilometers from Sardis to Susa. Ordinary travelers took 90 days to cross it. The royal couriers, riding in relay from station to station on fresh horses, could do it in about 7 to 9. The Greek historian Herodotus praised those riders in words that echo in the modern postal creed, that neither snow nor rain would stop them. The empire ran on the Aramaic language as a common tongue of administration, so that a command could travel across dozens of native languages. Its great ceremonial capital, Persepolis, was covered in reliefs showing delegations from every corner of the realm bringing tribute. Persian ideas of tolerance, of an ordered universe of truth against the lie, drawn from the Zoroastrian faith, would ripple into later religions. The Achaemenids fought the famous wars against the Greeks at Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis, and in the end, between 334 and 330 BCE, Alexander the Great conquered them, burning Persepolis to the ground. But the model they built, of roads, of a postal service, of standardized money, and of tolerant rule over many peoples, was copied by every empire that followed. From the First World Empire, we cross an ocean to a culture that seeded an entire hemisphere. Number 3, the Olmec. Every great civilization of ancient Mexico, the Maya, the Zapotec, the Aztec, inherited something from a people who came before them all. Archaeologists call the Olmec the mother culture of Mesoamerica. They lived on the humid Gulf Coast of Mexico from about 1200 to 400 BCE, and though their name is barely known, their fingerprints are on everything that followed. Their most famous creations are the colossal heads. 17 of them have been found, carved from single blocks of basalt, some standing over 3 meters tall and weighing up to 40 tons. Each has a distinct face, and each wears a helmet-like cap. These are thought to be portraits of individual rulers, which means the Olmec already had a hereditary elite very early in the Americas. The stone was hauled from mountains up to about 90 to 150 kilometers away, moved partly by river raft and partly by sheer human labor. But the Olmec gave Mesoamerica far more than monuments. They are strong candidates for inventing 2 of the most important ideas in the hemisphere. The first is the long count calendar, the great cycle that would later famously be misread as predicting the end of the world in 2012. The second is the concept of zero, used as a placeholder and represented by a shell-shaped glyph. The earliest dates in this system cluster in and around the Olmec region, before the Maya used it. They may also have invented the Mesoamerican ball game. Rubber balls dating to around 17 to 1600 BCE have been found at an Olmec-associated site. In fact, the very word Olmec comes from a later Aztec term, meaning rubber people. At their city of La Venta, the Olmec raised what may be the earliest pyramid in Mesoamerica, a clay mound about 30 meters high. They buried enormous offerings, including pavements of green serpentine blocks arranged as the face of a jaguar, and then covered them over. Hidden gifts, never meant to be seen again. Their religion centered on figures like a rain god and the strange were-jaguar, a being half human and half cat. They prized jade above gold. By around 400 BCE, the Olmec world had faded, and we still argue about why. But the template was set. Pyramids, the ball game, the calendar, the worship of jade, the portrait of the god king, all of it passed down the generations. Every later Mesoamerican civilization was, in a sense, building on Olmec foundations. From a culture that seeded a hemisphere, we come now to the second most transformative people on our entire list, the ones who gave the world its letters. Number 2, the Phoenicians. Look at the words on this screen. Nearly every letter you can read traces back, across 3,000 years, to a small seafaring people on the coast of what is now Lebanon. The Phoenicians did not build the largest empire or the tallest monuments. They gave the world something far more contagious. They gave it the alphabet. The Phoenicians rose to dominate Mediterranean trade from about 1200 to 300 BCE, sailing from their great city-states of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. Their writing system used just 22 consonant letters. Compare that to the hundreds of signs a scribe needed to master in Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform. The Phoenician system was simple enough that an ordinary merchant could learn it. And that simplicity changed the world, because it took writing out of the hands of a priestly elite and put it within reach of ordinary people. Around the 8th century BCE, the Greeks adopted this alphabet and added something the Phoenicians had left out: the vowels. The word alphabet itself comes from the first two Greek letters, alpha and beta, which come in turn from the Phoenician aleph and bet. From the Greek alphabet descend the Latin and Cyrillic scripts. From the related Aramaic branch descend Hebrew, Arabic, and many of the scripts of Asia. The overwhelming majority of alphabets in use on Earth today are children of this one invention. The Phoenicians were more than scribes, though. They were master mariners. They produced a legendary purple dye from the murex sea snail, so costly that it took tens of thousands of shellfish to make a tiny quantity, and the color became the very symbol of royalty. They founded colonies across the Mediterranean, including Carthage, which would one day rival Rome itself. And according to Herodotus, a crew of Phoenician sailors circumnavigated the entire continent of Africa around 600 BCE, a 3-year voyage commissioned by an Egyptian pharaoh. Herodotus reported, with disbelief, that the sailors claimed the sun had been on their right, to the north, as they rounded the southern tip. He thought this proved they were lying. In fact, it is exactly what would happen. That single doubted detail is the best evidence the voyage was real. Phoenician independence ended under the boots of Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and finally Alexander, who besieged Tyre in 332 BCE. But their gift outlived every one of those conquerors. The alphabet is arguably the most consequential invention in human history. And yet, for our final and greatest entry, we go back further still to the people who did not just change civilization, but invented it. Number 1, the Sumerians. Here, in the flat, hot land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in what is now southern Iraq, humanity crossed a threshold it would never step back over. Around 4000 BCE, the Sumerians built the first cities, and with them, they invented the very toolkit of civilization. Almost everything the other 9 cultures in this countdown achieved rested, in some way, on foundations the Sumerians laid first. Their great city, Uruk, sprawled across some 250 hectares and held tens of thousands of people. It is often called the first true city in the history of the world. To feed it, the Sumerians dug vast networks of irrigation canals across the dry floodplain, generating the food surplus that a city requires. And to manage that surplus, they invented writing. Cuneiform began around 3400 BCE as simple marks pressed into wet clay to count grain and livestock. Over time, those marks became abstract wedge shapes that could record not just numbers, but language itself. It is the earliest writing we know of, and it was born from the humble need to keep the accounts. The list of Sumerian firsts is staggering. They created the sexagesimal system, counting in base 60, which is the reason we still divide an hour into 60 minutes, a minute into 60 seconds, and a circle into 360 degrees. Every time you check a clock, you are thinking like a Sumerian. They developed advanced mathematics with multiplication tables and geometry. The wheel appears in Mesopotamia in the 4th millennium BCE. They built the first monumental temples, the great stepped ziggurats that towered over their cities and inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. They gave us the first written laws. The Code of Ur-Nammu, from around 2100 BCE, is the oldest surviving law code, 3 centuries older than the more famous laws of Hammurabi. They founded the first schools to train their scribes, and they left us the oldest great work of literature ever written, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of a king of Uruk searching for immortality, containing a flood narrative older than the one in Genesis. The city, writing, the wheel, law, timekeeping, literature, school. The Sumerians invented the frame through which every later society, including our own, would see the world. Their language eventually died, absorbed by Babylon and beyond. But we are all still living inside their inventions. And that is the thread that ties this entire countdown together. Step back from the 10, and a pattern comes into focus. These civilizations rose on different continents, in different millennia, speaking languages that never touched. And yet, they share a recipe. First comes surplus. A civilization needs more food than its farmers require, and each of these found a way to make it, whether through Sumerian canals, Nabataean runoff farming, or the flood of the Nile that fed both Egypt and Kush. Then comes memory. Nearly every culture on this list developed a way to store knowledge outside the human head, whether in cuneiform, hieroglyphs, oracle bones, Meroitic script, the long count, or the alphabet. Then comes monumental engineering, the pyramids and ziggurats, and stelae, and rock-cut temples that broadcast a state's power to anyone who saw them. Then comes metallurgy, the Chavín goldsmith, the Shang bronze caster, the Meroe ironworker, the Phoenician glassmaker. And binding it all together comes trade, and some central authority, a king, a priesthood, or a unifying cult that could coordinate the labor of thousands. Notice how differently each one solved the same problem. Chavín ruled by awe, drawing pilgrims into a machine of sound and shadow. Persia ruled by administration, by roads and satraps and couriers. Phoenicia ruled by commerce, spreading its letters along its trade routes. Aksum ruled by the wealth of the Red Sea, and Kush by iron and the bow. Egypt ruled by the certainty of the flood, and the Nabataeans by their mastery of every drop of water in a dry land. There was no single path to greatness, but there was always a threshold, the moment a people learned to coordinate more human beings than had ever cooperated before. And the single most powerful tool for crossing that threshold deserves a closer look. Of everything these civilizations achieved, one invention stands above the rest, because it changed not just what humans could build, but what humans could think. That invention is writing. Before it, all knowledge lived in memory, and died with the person who held it. After it, knowledge could outlive its maker, accumulate across generations, and travel across distances no voice could carry. What is astonishing is how many times humanity crossed this line independently. In Mesopotamia, with cuneiform. In Egypt, with hieroglyphs. In China, with the oracle bones of the Shang. In Mesoamerica, with the glyphs that grew out of the Olmec world. Each was a separate act of invention, and each began, more often than not, with the dull work of accounting, of recording who owned what. From those ledgers grew law, literature, history, and science. The alphabet was the final great leap. By reducing writing to just over 20 signs, the Phoenicians made literacy learnable by anyone, not just a trained scribal elite. Consider what that unlocked. A merchant could now keep his own records. A soldier could send his own message. Knowledge, once the guarded property of temples and palaces, began to spread outward through society, and it has been spreading ever since. And yet, for all its power, writing still guards its secrets. We can sound out the Meroitic script of Kush, but we cannot understand it. We can see the early writing of the Olmec, but we cannot fully read it. Somewhere in those undeciphered marks are the voices of the dead, still waiting. Which brings us to the things these civilizations built that we can see, and still barely comprehend. If writing rewired the mind, engineering reshaped the land itself. Consider what these 10 did with water, stone, and metal. The Nabataeans took a canyon that received barely 100 millimeters of rain a year and, through cisterns and pipes and dams, turned it into a city of 30,000. That is not decoration. That is survival, engineered. The Egyptians and the Kushites raised pyramids, feats less of brute strength than of logistics, of organizing and feeding and housing armies of workers for decades. The Aksumites tried to raise a single carved stone of over 500 tons and reached the very limit of what human muscle and rope could do, for the great stele appears to have broken in the attempt. The Meroites built furnaces that poured out iron to arm their fields and their soldiers. The Persians dug hidden underground channels, called qanats, to carry water across deserts, and laid roads that stitched an empire together. And beneath all of it lay the Sumerian canal and the Sumerian plow, the humble tools that first made a food surplus possible. These monuments were also messages. A pyramid, a stele, a rock-cut temple, each told every traveler who passed that here was a power to be reckoned with. And in Sneferu's 3 Egyptian pyramids, we can even watch the engineers learn from their mistakes, adjusting the angle, refining the form, until they got it right. But for all we have decoded, a great deal remains stubbornly out of reach. Honesty requires admitting how much of this story is still a mystery. The Meroitic script of Kush can be pronounced but not understood, its language a locked door. The Epi-Olmec writing of Mexico remains only partly deciphered. We do not know exactly how the Chavín oracle worked, how much was acoustics, how much was drugs, and how much was sheer theater. We are not even certain what Petra's treasury was truly for, though the tomb found beneath it in 2024 offers a new clue. We do not know for certain whether Aksum's great stele ever stood upright, or whether it fell the moment they tried to raise it. We do not fully understand why several of these civilizations collapsed. Chavín faded, the Olmec declined, the old kingdom of Egypt broke apart, and in each case we can point to suspects: climate, drought, social upheaval, but we cannot close the case. For nearly every one of these cultures, there are competing explanations. There is the mainstream scholarly reading, careful and cautious. There is the deeper archaeological interpretation, drawn from the dirt and the stone. And there is the fringe theory, the speculative leap, which we should treat not with contempt, but with curiosity, even when the evidence does not support it. The truth is that the archaeological record is full of gaps. These civilizations left us monuments, but they did not leave us all their answers. And every new excavation reminds us how much of the human story is still buried, waiting to be read. And what they did leave, we are still, right now, living inside. So why do these 10 belong together? And why does it matter? Because each of them left something that never went away. When you glance at a clock and read 60 minutes to the hour, that is the Sumerians, reaching across 6,000 years. When you read these very words, that is the Phoenicians, whose alphabet became the ancestor of your own. When you mark a date on a calendar of 365 days, that is the old kingdom of Egypt. When a fifth of the world writes in Chinese characters, that is the Shang and the cracks they read in burned bone. When an Ethiopian priest chants in Ge'ez, that is Aksum still speaking. When archaeologists trace the calendar and the ball game of the Maya, they are following a trail back to the Olmec, the tolerant road-linked administration that Rome and every later empire borrowed. That was Persia. The art of wringing a city from a waterless desert. That was the Nabataeans. The proof that pyramids and iron and literate kingship flourished deep in Africa. That was Kush. And the idea that a people with no writing and no army could still unite a region through sheer wonder. That was Chavín. Here, then, is the quiet argument beneath this whole countdown. To be advanced is not only a matter of technology, It is a matter of ideas powerful enough to outlive the people who had them. Every civilization on this list is gone. Their languages faded, their kings turned to dust, their cities fell silent. And yet, not one of them truly died, because we are still living inside the things they built, the words they wrote, and the time they taught us how to count.